Hey, Tolkien Poppers. This episode is sponsored by Theology Beer Camp 2026. And Theology Beer Camp is just an awesome place where philosophers, theologians, and various types of pop culture nerds have been meeting on a yearly basis. And it is an awesome event organized by Trip Fuller from Homebrewed Christianity. And if you have heard me on the podcast or been a part of the Tolkien Heads class or even seen some of my writing, you know that bringing together niche philosophy, theology, and Tolkien is part of my whole thing. And that will be present at Theology Beer Camp too. So there'll be links in the show note, but get your tickets for Theology Beer Camp 2026. It will be in Kansas City, Missouri on October 8th through October 10th. Hope to see you there. What up, Tolkien Poppers? It's Nick here with another episode of the podcast where I get to sit down with Dr. Luke Shelton, who did his doctoral work at the University of Glasgow. And we get to sit down and talk about his graduate work. And his specific work is studying how young readers interpret The Lord of the Rings and experience The Lord of the Rings. And it's just fascinating. We talk about his reader response approach to his work, and even we talk about relationality and experience. And we also talk about just a couple other things, namely his work as the editor-in-chief for Malorn, the academic journal of the Tolkien Society. We talk a little bit about Westmoot, which is a conference organized by the Tolkien Society. It'll be in Minneapolis this year from May 22nd to the 24th, and Luke is part of the organizing team for that, and so there'll be links in the show notes, but we talk about that too. But this is a cool conversation where we talk everything from Tolkien to theory to sociology to the realm of pedagogy and education. So I hope that this conversation with Luke is enjoyable and that you get connected to his work and get connected to the Tolkien Society in general, because that's where you meet cool people like Luke. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this conversation with Dr. Luke B. Shelton. What's up, Tolkien Poppers? It is Nick here, and I'm excited to be joined by Dr. Luke Shelton, who is the editor-in-chief for Malorn, which is the academic journal of the Tolkien Society, and he is got his PhD in critical studies, right? Critical studies?
Just English literature in the School
English
of Critical
literature.
Studies, but just English literature is the PhD.
Yeah, and so, Luke's here. He went to the University of Glasgow, and we've had a couple of Glasgow students as well as grads on here, so people know that the University of Glasgow rules. So, Luke Shelton, welcome to Tolkien Pop. Thanks for hanging out with us.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Nick. It's interesting to actually do this kind of in a more formal setting because normally we're just kind of talking on our own. So,
Yeah, and for listeners, I've been doing production on Malorn for the past I guess it's been almost 6 years now, or if not, we're right in the 6th year here. So Luke
Mhm,
and I started, I think, at the same time. And so
mhm.
since 2020, Luke and I have been working on Malorn. And we've been collaborating. Luke's, he sees us as a team, but Luke is technically, who I report to. He's my superior, the boss here. But when Luke said we talk, we talk, you know, kind of on that level, and he's helped me with research. But now we're doing a real formal interview, so it's getting real serious, Luke. It's getting real
I know.
serious.
Hopefully, I live up to the hype.
Oh, I think so. I think people will be stoked. So yeah, I guess too, Luke. I mean, people, we're going to talk about research, but before we do, I mean, you've done the podcasting thing, right? And you've done like online presence and stuff. Before we dive into anything, could you talk to us about like maybe the Tolkien Experience podcast and even your Tolkien Experience project in general?
Yeah. So if you want, I could kind of incorporate that with my own Tolkien kind of background.
Oh yeah.
Um, so I came to Tolkien in middle school, um, and it's so weird how there are just some like reading experiences that are real visceral, and you remember like where you were reading when you were reading and those kinds of things. Like I remember sitting in the science classroom in middle school with like those stone tabletops that won't catch fire,
Oh yeah.
and just like leaning on those tables and reading because I remember that like pressure on my arms. Um, Very weird sense memories there. Um, and that had to have been like a year or two before the Jackson films came out. But I was such a sheltered, didn't know anything about the world around me kind of kid that I had no concept that there were movies in the pipeline at all. Um, and I came to The Lord of the Rings um, because I think my mother had recommended them to me after I had uh, been exposed to The Hobbit earlier. Um, the funny thing about The Hobbit is that I was aware of that in elementary school, and then we actually had a reader come and recite the Hobbit to us
Oh,
as
that's
part of
cool.
our elementary school. And I know I had to have read it before then because I was that kind of kid that I was sitting there waiting for him to mess up. So I could be like, no, that's not right. Uh, and I have not changed, I guess. But um, yeah, so I've had a very long passion for Tolkien, starting in elementary school, the most impactful one being that middle school reading. Um, and then, you know, went into education to be a teacher, an English teacher, and then went back to get my advanced degree, and was told, don't focus on fantasy, don't focus on Tolkien. You'll never get a job if you do that. So I did a master's in early British literature. My master's thesis was on Beowulf. Got out, looked around, and realized I wasn't going to get a job with that either. So then I went back and looked for a PhD program that I could do on Tolkien, basically. Um, and I just, through a series of um, coincidences, really, and a happenstance, I ended up my master's thesis director had worked with Dimitra Fimi on some Greek translations of some Arthurian texts. So that's the connection I had to Dimitra Fimi to introduce myself and say, hi, I've worked with this person and you know this person. I wondered if I could work with you on a PhD thesis. And so that's how I got linked up to her. And I was actually with her the year before she moved to Glasgow. So that's how I ended up in Glasgow was following Dimitra when she transferred over there.
Oh, that is cool. Yeah,
Hmm.
people will be familiar with Dimitra Fimi, but she is she's like the director or the person at the head of the Center for Fantasy and Fantastic at Glasgow, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Co-director, and I think she's actually recently handed off the directorship to a couple of her colleagues. But yeah, she was co-director there for 5 years, I think, when they were first starting it up.
Okay. Okay.
Hmm.
So you kind of like that whole wave. You were there before, had a cool connection, and then sort of transferred over into Glasgow as that was happening.
Yeah, and they've really made a remarkable program there where it's just kind of an area completely dedicated to the study of fantasy, and it's kind of remarkable and unique in that I don't know that we have another place like it in the English speaking world, to be honest, where you have so many people trying to get in because this is the place to do that. Um, had no idea that that would be part of my path in any way. So, like I said, just a whole lot of coincidence and luck in a lot of ways. Um, but as part of that experience of mine, um, what I got to be really interested in was not necessarily trying to nail down something about the text, because that's never been really interesting to me. I never wanted to be like, oh, here's the way to read the book. Um, Instead, I've always been more curious about the different ways that people read the book. Um, and, I don't want to get bogged down in theory or anything like that, but um, through my master's learning about Eiser's theory of the gaps in a text and how we fill gaps in a text with our own experience, and that makes it a unique text to us each time a new person reads the book. Um, Really fascinated me. And so that's what I wanted to study when I got to my PhD. Um, and so that led to the dissertation being about the reception of The Lord of the Rings by readers under the age of 18 specifically. So yeah, that was just a real um, blessing that I was able to find something that I could dig into that wholly for honestly a difficult process.
Yeah, I mean, all I know is that dissertations. I feel like that's a universal thing, the difficult process.
Mhm.
Which for those who don't know, which I'll have it linked in the show notes, Luke's dissertation is titled "Small Hands Do Them Because They Must: Examining the Reception of the Lord of the Rings Among Young Readers." And so you've already kind of told us sort of like the theory part that fascinates you, and then of course the Tolkien stuff that how that sort of accidentally happened with Dimitri Fimi as well as bringing in your experience there. But I guess really like, could you give us some of more of like the nitty gritty of your dissertation and maybe more about how you were able to explore that? And if you want to, this like like Tolkien Pop is sort of geared towards a little more academic focus. So if you want to nerd out on some stuff, you totally can, on some theory and then even more academic approaches that you took.
Um, oh yeah, let's get into some methodology talk. Yeah, let's do
Yeah.
it. Um, so one of the things that made me want to focus on young readers specifically is reviewing and thinking about my own experience when I was younger and realizing that I had some thoughts and interpretations and feelings about the text that as I got older and got exposure to the Jackson films and other fans and fan communities and groups and forums and all these kinds of things, I realized that my own ideas kind of shifted and starting aligning more with prevailing opinions. And that's just kind of enculturation. That's just kind of what happens to us as we're immersed in something. We kind of tend to adopt parts of it. Um, so, for instance, in my first reading of The Lord of the Rings, I was scared of Tom Bombadil. That whole like Earth spirit, who knows who he is, but he's a benevolent person, did not clock with me. Um, I very much did not trust him because Gandalf said, don't trust anybody outside of the Shire. And then, we're trapped with Old Man Willow, and then this guy says he's going to help us, but he like gets us out of the tree and then walks away. And then we have to like follow him through the creepy woods and we stay in his house and have bad dreams. Like, it's not the best experience. So I really didn't trust him until like he put them on the path and walked away after the Barrow Downs. Like it's like okay, maybe he's not gonna like rob us and leave us completely helpless. Um, but as I grew older, I was like, oh, no one else thinks about it that way. Everyone else thinks that he's like a nice guy. Um, and so just being curious about whether that happened to other young readers and whether they had unique experiences or interpretations that we could capture before they got immersed in, you know, the larger Tolkien fan community in a way. Um, of course, they're always going to be influenced by like their parents if their parents read it with them or if their parents showed them the movies or something. Um, and I did, do a survey about whether or not they'd seen the movies or played video games or heard, the BBC radio adaptation, just to be aware of any other influences that were on their interpretation. But um, really just trying to focus in on what they pulled out of the text and came up with some really fascinating things. Um, but before we get to the results, let's get into some nerdy methodology stuff, if that's okay.
Oh, yes, please. Yes, please.
So when you're dealing with um, having young participants in a study, there are a whole lot of Um, first of all, you have to have like ethics oversight and things like that. But just in terms of actually having a beneficial interview, um, when you first start to think about it, you don't think about, well, there's actually a power dynamic just because I'm older than the participant. In
Mm,
most
mm,
cases, they will tend to see me as an authority figure just because I'm older. Um, and that can skew their responses. They might try to give you the response that you want instead of, the response that they feel, or they might try to answer the questions correctly rather than um, the way that's the most personally honest to them. And so I had to do a lot of research about how do you break down that disparity in an investigative kind of interview setting, and it ended up with a couple different activities that kind of um, break away from normal just kind of question and answer, and really try to create activities that you're essentially working on with them. Um, so that way it's kind of a cooperative digging into their own interpretation rather than here I am with the clipboard. Now see if you can answer the questions the way I have it written down. Um, One of my favorite activities was it's called a diamond ranking activity. And if you can think of a diamond that has 9 spaces, there's one at the top, then a row that has two, then a row that has three. So we're already at six. So then our next row has two, and then our last row has one. So you have a diamond shape, one on top, one on bottom. Um, and well, it naturally has 9. So my first thought was, okay, let's rank the members of the fellowship. And one of the things that you're trying to get to with a diamond ranking activity is you're not trying to get to a correct answer. You're trying to get to what decisions and choices do they make when they're ranking things. So you give them the diamond, you say, and you give them kind of a vague prompt, like, okay, pick your favorite or the best. You leave it open-ended so that they have to figure out what does it mean to be my favorite or what does it mean to be the best character. So I just left it with favorite and least favorite. Um, and then they would rank them, and you go through and you say, okay, you put Sam as your favorite. Why did you think Sam was your favorite character? Um, okay, in your next row, I see you put Aragorn and Gandalf. Why were these your next favorite characters? Why didn't you like them as much as Sam? Why do you like them more than Legolas or Gimli? And so you're asking probing questions to understand the ranking and to have a conversation that fleshes out their reasoning that, in most cases we don't ever actually flesh out. We just give people the answer. Um, and so that's what I mean when I'm talking about, it's a cooperative thing. We're both trying together to figure out what they were thinking when they put these things in this order. Um, and it's a completely subjective ordering. There's no truth in that ordering anywhere. Um, Certainly no capital T truth, I guess.
yeah, yeah.
Um, and then the other thing that I really enjoyed was um, it's called a photo elicitation activity. And um, in a more traditional um, way of using it, it's using photos to help participants have recall of events or um, activities that have occurred in the past. Um, and so you're using photos to prompt a participant. In this instance, though, I used kind of a modified format where what I did was I used public domain images of different settings, and I would ask the participant which of the images reminded them the most of a given setting in The Lord of the Rings. So, for instance, the Shire. Here are 4 different images. One has like a whole lot of trees. One's like a river running through a forest. One's like a golden path walking along the side of a forest. One's just like a big meadow. And you say, okay, which one of these reminds you the most of the Shire? One's like just a golden path walking along beside the forest, and one's just like a big meadow. And so then you go, okay, so thinking about the Shire, which of these 4 images reminds you the most of the Shire? And they take a little while to figure out which one that is. And then you ask probing questions about, which one of what about this picture reminded you about the Shire? And why did you pick this one instead of um, th- uh, these other pictures? say if you pick the big meadow, why didn't you pick the one with trees or the one with the river? Um, and again, what you're most interested in is getting to that level of reasoning, not their answer, but why they put that answer. Um, and so, because both of the activities that I chose um, were all about cognition and reasoning, that's what really the data set is. It's the reasoning in the interviews, and then that led to the dissertation. Um, so we could talk a little bit more about that if you wanted, or if you want me to hurry up and get to the conclusions, the interesting parts, I can do that.
No, I love hearing all of that, and I think that as somebody who also shares an education background, and Luke and I, as we've gotten to know each other, we have a bunch of different connections. We both went to college in Nashville, Tennessee. I went to Trevecca. You went to Belmont, right?
hmm
Yeah, and
And
so
my
go
mom
ahead.
worked at Trevecca for a while.
Yeah. So like
hmm
there's all these weird connections that Luke and I found out that we have. And eventually I did not start out in education. I started out in religion. But you did religion too to a certain extent too, right, in your undergrad?
Yeah, yeah, that
Yeah.
was one of my majors. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then eventually we got here. So I think the education background can be really helpful for this sort of approach. Obviously it can also be depending on your philosophy behind teaching and your pedagogy, it can hinder you too, depending on if you're looking for rigid answers. And, everything has, some sort of platonic form that you're trying to guide readers to. But it sounds like, which I think this is more helpful. I mean, especially your Tom Bombadil experience, which is just so fascinating because in like if we're looking at like TV and other stories, the way that Tom Bombadil functions does seem super shady, right? I feel like there's always that character in TV where you're like, oh, of course they're a helper, and then all of a sudden they're like an agent of the enemy and they betray them at the last second, right? So I think that's really cool that you picked that up on. But you know, if someone had been, I don't know, like going with you and testing your interpretive abilities, they might have shot that down, right? And it would have taken away that perspective. Where obviously Tom Bombadil isn't that, but it doesn't mean that you can't read Tom Bombadil like that and you can't get stuff from that reading of him. And in my own teaching, I try to, also coax kids' interpretation and experiences first, while also making sure that they're actually reading and recalling the correct things. But yeah, I don't know. Like it just, I love that approach. And did your kids like your students without, if this doesn't break some of the ethical stuff, like did they respond really like well to those approaches? Like did you pick up that they like enjoyed that, or like it brought out a lot more, um, I don't know, like it created a safe environment for them. Do you feel that way?
Um, I feel like, well, you're obviously dealing with self-selection bias with this kind of population. It's like they had to come to me and say they wanted to do the study, right? So
Sure.
they obviously were already pretty motivated to tell me their opinions. But I feel like um, these activities were better than just a straightforward interview because, I mean, some of them took 2 hours long, and what kid, I think my youngest participant was 6. What kid is going to sit there for 2 hours unless it's something that they're okay kind of digging into and enjoying at least a little bit? Um, and I think I think for the most part, I don't remember any of the participants ever like demonstrating boredom, like which, if that were the case, it'd be like, hey, do we need to pause and we can have another session some other time, because this kind of research in many ways it's kind of a sociological research as well as literary, but in many ways is you're trying to make it as um, comfortable for the interviewee as possible because I as a teacher I had a constructivist approach. And so it doesn't matter if it's on my time. It matters if we're getting to the truth, if we're getting to what's helping you learn and grow and things like that. So that's very much the same with this interviewing method. Um, I can give you one example of I actually had to break the photo elicitation methodology a couple times because of something that a participant said. So like I told you I'd have four pictures and I'd ask them, okay, think of Rivendell. Which of these four pictures remind you the most of Rivendell? Well, they'd pick one and we talk about it. And the one that they picked would actually be aligned with another subgroup that all had similarities with the one picture they picked in the main group. So the reason for that was I would get more information, more detailed information in that subgroup because if they all shared, like if they picked something that had a tree and a house kind of up in the tree, well, then all the other set will have houses up in a tree. And so it makes them give me more information in detail about what kinds of houses do they see, what kinds of trees do they see, those kinds of things. Um, but if they picked the tree and the house, but their entire conversation was about the kind of tree and didn't address the house at all, and if I ask them, is the house being there important to you at all? And they say, well, no, it's really just the trees. Well, I can't go to that subset that's all about looking at the houses and the trees because that's not what's important to them. Instead, I'll go over to this other subset that's about different trees that I had for a different picture. So, it's you have the design, but you break the design sometimes if it's not conducive to finding that truth for that interviewee. Um, I kind of think that's kind of the point of good project design, right? It's um, especially when we're getting to qualitative data rather than quantitative data, which is what this one was about. It's what depth of information can we achieve with each interviewee, rather than let's interview 1,000 people and try and make some overarching generalizations. Um, so kind of to that same point, it's trying to design them in a way that made them as comfortable as possible and really keeping the focus on them and allowing them to explore their own interpretations, I think really helped them open up. Um, and I can say, because this doesn't break any kind of um, privacy, that the responses that I've gotten from academic readers of my research, um, I frequently get comments like, I'm really impressed how deep they went in their conversation with you. I've gotten a lot of comments like that of just people being surprised how uh, the level of comfort that's demonstrated in the answers, both that they were able to get to such granular detail for their age and also comfortable sharing that with me. Both of those things have been remarked upon to me several times. Um, so that makes me feel good, I guess.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you should feel good, especially with the carefulness and just, I feel like the adjustments that you're making, and even something like this. I think if people aren't familiar, which people who listen to this won't have an issue with this, but people who are like, oh, how could you do a PhD on Tolkien in any way, right? And thinking like, actually, you're doing some really careful research and really trying to get as close as you can to articulating an objective qualitative experience of one of your students, and then giving like, okay, here's one of the experiences that they led, and it gives us insight not into just this individual but possibly into a wider range of populace and their interpretation, and the way that they experience a text. And you were talking about how like the in-depth in-depth sort of exploration that these young readers had, and I remember hearing a presentation that you did a couple years ago, or last year at the first Westmoot, and you had brought that up a little bit in your research. But could you actually tell us about like the Boromir thing, because I feel like that's a really good example of your young readers really just getting real complex and just exploring Boromir in a way that's like, whoa, how did young readers really engage Boromir at that
Um,
level?
are you talking about the one who talked about them being brothers?
Maybe, or the one where, or like, okay, so the like general, or maybe you tell me what it was because I might have missed it. So either that one, or when people thought that he was bad but also thought that he was like the most relatable character.
Ah, right. Okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah, the relatableness. Okay. So Boromir far and away was the least favorite character of all the participants.
Yeah.
And the reflections on that were pretty standard for what you would expect for this age range. They were fairly a lot of the times they were fairly moralistic or condemning of like he's a bad guy, he did bad things, that kind of thing. Um, and if you pressed on that a little bit harder, it's not that they hated Boromir, it's just none of the other characters did something like that. And so of course he goes to the bottom because he did. He's the one who tried to take the ring, so he's at the bottom. Um, and that was far and away the majority opinion. Um, but then I did ask, like we're leading into which characters they found the most relatable, and the hobbits were up there at the top, but then also Boromir was up there at the top. And through follow-up questions on that, um, which unfortunately that wasn't a planned part of the interview at all. It was probably about 10 interviews in, I realized um, to start asking about that relatable aspect of it, because I hadn't asked about it earlier on, but in the conversations, I realized this could actually open up a new line of inquiry. So we only have about 20 responses for that instead of the 30 that we have for all the others. Um, but it was fascinating to hear how many of them who ranked Boromir as the most relatable did so because of his flaws. Um, they would explain it either as, he's struggling to live up to the pressure and expectations of the culture that he's in because of his flaws, or he struggles and succumbs to temptation, or he's tempted by the ring, and I'm a man, so I would be tempted by the ring. Those were all very much a part of those conversations, and it's kind of remarkable when you think about that age group that they're already kind of in some ways grappling with their own humanity in a way that I don't think we give teenagers and preteens credit for.
No, big time. I mean, as a high school teacher, and you've probably experienced this too. Of there's just so many adults who I think we just forget as we get further away from that age those experiences because we don't experience things like that anymore. So there's a grain of salt there, or like a benefit of the doubt I give to adults, but there's sort of this like either expectation that kids aren't that emotionally capable, of experiencing that or even self reflection. They young readers in general, whether they're 6 or even 18, they tend to get overlooked. And then, of course, that's kind of like part of your research, right? That they get overlooked not only in their literal reading ability, but in their reception of the text in general, as we've talked about. And you kind of brought this up a little bit in sort of the I guess in the theory part maybe of your dissertation, but it was in a different direction. But it kind of made me think about like how Tolkien, I think, points to a sort of related problem when he pointed out the habit of adults dismissing fantasy or fairy stories as like quote unquote for children. Um, and I think there's something there that's connected to also dismissing young readers as like not being capable of doing that sort of reading or self-reflection. But like, what do you think like readers, scholars, and Tolkienists in general miss out when we forget that young readers or young fans live within our sort of literary ecology?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and it is something that I've hit on in the dissertation. And I try to bring it up in all of the presentations I do as well, because honestly, at this point, I kind of see myself as the apologist for young readers in a way.
Yeah.
That there has always been a phenomenon of what we call cross reading, where it's um, adults reading children's texts. Um, you call it a crossover novel. You call people who read children's or young adult fiction cross readers, those kinds of things. But for some reason, they never apply it to the opposite direction. They never apply it to kids who read adult books. And it's like, why not? That's been a thing since the 1500s. Like kids read Robinson Crusoe, which we think is like high literature right now. Kids read Dracula. Kids read, all of these like adventure tales that we have. Pilgrim's Progress, that was a moral tale for children, um, and other people, but children. Um, and so, I do think that part of our short-sightedness is not realizing that children have always read quote unquote adult books or adult literature, even if it's not geared towards them. Um, and I think when we do that, we kind of limit our understanding of the possible interpretations of a text. And I don't think that by opening up and appreciating the interpretations of uh, children to adult literature, I don't think that's the only step in understanding the breadth of interpretation. I do think other aspects are important as well. So, like, if we only looked at male interpretation versus female interpretation, or those gendered as men versus those gendered as women, or those who are racially white or racially identify as black, if we seclude any one population, we're going to miss out on an entire um, plethora of ideas and interpretations that someone else's life experience could give us for a text. And it just happens to be that age is one of those demographic measures that has been pushed aside throughout, academic discourse, and especially as fantasy has been taken more and more into academia. The readers who are younger and younger, their interpretations get farther and farther away from the conversation. And one of my favorite visual images is as Tolkien Studies finally walks through the door of academia, we can't close the door behind us. We have to put our foot in the door and keep the door open for everyone else to come into. That's part of our job. So let's bring all the other fantasists, bring all the other sci-fi, um, and with it, let's bring more children's lit. I know that there is a pretty healthy children's lit academic field, but bringing up children's lit into the same conversations that we have about fantasy and science fiction, I think is warranted. Um, so yeah, I do think one of the key things that is lost is different ways of interpreting a text, and it's really kind of ironic because I'm sure your listeners will know who Harold Bloom is, one of the biggest kind of literary um, commenters and editors and such in the 20th century.
Yeah, definitely tried to like establish a sort of Western literary canon, like a
Hmm.
real like hard list.
Yeah, absolutely. And he professed to not liking Tolkien, even though he edited two collections of essays about Tolkien. But okay, whatever. Methinks he doth protest too much. But even he has this book, A Map of Misreading, where he talks about misreading as a function of any reader. And I kind of take that and extend it to, in a way, all reading is misreading because none of us will ever be able to sit down and read Tolkien's words and interpret it the exact way he intended it. Um, and I when I say things like that, people tend to kind of get up in arms. So I've developed kind of a thought experiment to kind of show them what I mean. Um, so say you were one of the first readers of The Lord of the Rings, and you get to the Weathertop part, and Aragorn tells you the story of Beren and Luthien. Well, when you first read that, you're like, oh, this is a great love story. Oh, this is wonderful. There's like a whole background and mythology here. And then it's not even until later in that book that you understand, oh, Beren and Luthien kind of mirrors Aragorn and Arwen in a way. I had to find that in the appendices. If I didn't read the appendices, I wouldn't even know that. Well, then years later, the Silmarillion comes out, and it puts so much more context and weight into the tale that Aragorn tells us in The Lord of the Rings that now, if you go back and read it, you're going to have a completely different interpretation. It doesn't mean your first interpretation is wrong because you were able to get a completely valid reading of The Lord of the Rings without all that context. So let's say that you're the most informed, popular reader. You've read the Silmarillion, Lord of the Rings, all that stuff. So you feel pretty sure in your interpretation. But then you get to the letters and you realized, oh wow, Tolkien put Luthien on Edith's headstone. So that changes the interpretation entirely if you want it to. It's how much of these relationships is Tolkien modeling on his own relationships. And then the real question is, will we ever possibly know what he meant by that? If his relationship with his wife, such a complex and intricate thing, influenced this tale in some way. There's no way we can know exactly all the emotions, feelings, and experiences that he was investing in that part of the work ever. And so this is where that theory of the gaps comes in. It's okay, I'm reading a story where a man and a woman fall in love. It's because the woman's dancing in the forest. Okay, so this is reminding me of things that I've read where it's like an elven maiden and she's an enchantress. She's weaving some kind of spell on him. Maybe he falls in love with her, but it doesn't seem like it's like a wicked one. It's not an evil elf who's going to like drag him to the underworld and he's going to die. So, it's coming up against my experiences rather than those other parts of Tolkien that I haven't read yet or that I don't know about. And so you're having to fill it in with your own experiences as you go. And because of that, um, everyone's reading is, in a way, a misreading because they will never read Tolkien the way that Tolkien wrote Tolkien. So that's what's
Ah,
absolutely fascinating to me about um, response theory.
yeah, I love that, and just kind of hitting all sort of a vast. I'm just going to cast in kind of a big net over multiple points that you brought up, but I even think about like for young readers, I do Lord of the Flies with one of my classes, and I've been doing it every year. I just love that book. I think there's so much you can get out of it, and there was one part of the book that I was interpreting a certain way symbolically. And there's a part where it says that one of the kids sharpens a stick at both ends. And I was like, okay, it's obviously a symbol for violence. Both the sticks they're practical. They're like ready to use both sides to just, it's pure savagery or whatever. And one kid goes, Mr. Polk, I think that's where they put the pig's head. I think they're going to put Ralph's head on that stick. And I was like, you might be right about that. And if I had read that and had like, oh no, this is a symbol, I could have crushed that interpretation. And like I said, I don't really have a reason to do that, right? Except for I'm kind of basing that off of my own misreading, kind of what you were talking about, my own experience. Oh, and I'm trying to think of a way to connect that to your explication of like irony there of just sort of trying to create some sort of objective reading through misreading, which um, I don't really know the point there, but I don't know. Could you maybe to save me from rambling nonsense, like, could you maybe tell me more about like what you discovered through maybe unveiling that sort of thing is not as reliable as we think it is?
So that there's no kind of definitive version of a text.
Sure, without, and I think maybe you can tell me if we agree or disagree here, but sort of like we know that Lord of the Rings isn't about purple aliens, right, for the most part. But you can't really get to a sort of immutable interpretation or meaning of the text.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I kind of think about it in a couple different ways. One is basically I disregard pretty much any claims of authoritative interpretation. Um, so like no one can come in and say this is the one way to read the book.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that's demonstrable just because if you look at scholars, scholars disagree all the time, and these are the people who read the most and are actually paid to tell other people what books mean, and they disagree a lot. Um, and so I don't think anyone has the keys to the kingdom of any one book, not even the author. Um, because I can't tell you the number of times I've written something and someone else came and read it, and I'm like, that's better than what I wrote. And so, yes, we'll go with that. Like the flaw with thinking that the author has the authoritative interpretation of the text is you assume that the author is a perfect author, that the author can perfectly convey what is in their mind. That's impossible. I can't ever 100% clearly say what I want to say. That reminds me of the C.S. Lewis quote, actually, from "Till We Have Faces." The fox is saying to his people, and I'm going to say it's a paraphrase because I'm going to not say it 100% accurate. But he says to someone he's tutoring, to say the very thing you mean, the whole of it, no more or less or other than what you actually mean, is the whole art and joy of words. And that's true. We're all constantly seeking to find the best way to communicate what we're trying to communicate. And we can see this in Tolkien specifically by the number of time boy has to redraft something. And most of the time, the editor is finally like, I'm just going to take it from you now, and we're going to publish this thing. And so I don't ever think that Tolkien was able to 100% put down on paper exactly what he envisioned. And I don't see that as a flaw. I see that as being human. And so that's why I kind of disregard any kind of authoritative interpretation of a text. But then we also have to talk about accuracy when we're talking about interpretations. So, for instance, if you factually misconstrue something about a text, that can still influence your interpretation, and your interpretation is valid. It has worth and value, especially to you as the person who had that reading, but it is not accurate to the text if it gets some of the facts wrong. So, for instance, one of the participants in their first reading thought Mary was a girl because in their entire life, Mary was a girl's name. And so it wasn't until apparently about halfway through that their parent corrected them, no, Mary's a boy. And so even still in our conversation, they would slip into the she, her pronouns for Mary. So clearly there's still some overlap here where they're trying to kind of fight back against that original interpretation. And so then the thought experiment comes, well, if Mary is a girl, how different is the Durnhelm chapter? If you think about Mary being a girl with Eowyn being disguised as Durnhelm in order to go fight with the other soldiers. And that can be an inaccurate reading, but it can also be a very valuable reading. So those are kind of the different metrics I use: accuracy, value, and for me, value deals more with personal or cultural value than with accuracy.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think that just is just like a perfect sort of segue into my next question, because I think this is like one of my favorite things that I love about your approach. And I feel like this is sort of a similar approach that's cultivated and comes out of the Center for the Fantastic in Glasgow. But there really isn't, there's this really heavier focus on experience and relationality over theory or abstraction, I like to call it. But like, obviously academia can get bogged down with theory sometimes. Like we already have mentioned theory and talked a little bit about it, and you and I can nerd out over it. But if these theories don't translate to real life things, it's almost like, what's the point?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess rather than stay in the abstract, why did you choose to explore experience and relationality, and why did your findings nicely integrate into emerge from that approach? And I guess you've kind of talked about like why for a lot of time, like that you've brought or at least focus on experience and relationality. But yeah, bring in some other thoughts and then how that integrated into what happened in your dissertation there.
Yeah. Just as I explored, at the beginning of my PhD, how to approach kind of looking at children and the Lord of the Rings, young readers in the Lord of the Rings, and you start reading theory about children's literature, young adult literature, the thing that you come across over and over and over again is the implied reader. And if I could write a manifesto, it would be the death of the implied reader, because the implied reader is almost always a projection of whatever scholar is doing the reading. It's here's the ways that the book speaks to me, and therefore it is the implied reader of the book, basically. For as many decades as that's been kind of talked around or avoided, at the end of the day, that's pretty much what that is. It's a guise for using yourself as the key reader of the text. Or the other way that it's been used is to essentially try to whitewash the implied reader of a text. And I kind of mean that literally as a white, straight male reader. The implied reader has been the white, straight male, college educated reader, and we're trying to piece together a text the same way that that implied reader would do it. And the more that I got into thinking about my early responses and how, those were pushed aside when I came up against kind of the hegemonic interpretation of the text, then how is the implied reader any different? It's just a way to steamroll people's actual experiences. And so then that's when you come into reader response theory as kind of the way to get around that kind of one size fits all approach. And honestly, I think if a text could only be read the way that the implied reader reads it, no text would live more than 20 years because we'd all read it, go, okay, got that, let's move on. We'd find a new book. Um, but because we're all unique individuals with our own experiences and thoughts and opinions and emotions, we all read a text a different way. And because of that, it's the conflict and discovery of new interpretations that keep these things active. You know, a lot of people want to say that the reason that Peter Jackson's films have stayed around is because they're so magnificent and brilliant. I don't argue that they're really, really fantastic films. I love them. I watch them a lot. They're award-winning films, so technically they are very good films. But there are a lot of technically very good films that we don't watch anymore, you know? And so I think one of the things that Jackson's films has done is it's been able to live in the same kind of gaps that Tolkien originally created, in that it's left enough space for us to put our own thoughts and opinions and emotions into the film without telling us how to feel all the way through the film. So I think that's kind of where I landed when I came into the PhD process is, I have these different tools to decode the text, and I could go about it that way, but really, I want to know what's real. What are people actually experiencing? And that's what I want to talk about and explore instead of trying to assume what people are talking about and exploring. And if you want to get super kind of meta theoretical, we can do that for a second and talk about different approaches to meaning in a work.
Please do.
So yeah, thinking about meta from like a cognitive uh, kind of backed out, zoomed out level. Um, I was lucky enough in undergrad that I had to take a theory course. It was required. And at that point, I was exposed to kind of a triangular theory of meaning from a text, talking about that there are three different places that you can look for meaning within any work. You can look to the text itself, you can look to the author, or you can look to the reader. And you can approach it from any of these angles, but whichever angle you choose determines which kind of theoretical approaches you use. So as a reader response theorist, I'm all about giving the reader the ability to make meaning of the text. If you're dealing with like the implied reader, you're dealing with the new critics, you're dealing with the Vanderbilt School. They are very much the text has meaning in and of itself. If we can pull out those symbols, those metaphors, those similes, and we can decode them together, boom, that's the meaning of the text. Um, you get more into authorial intent, and that's when you're getting into the author establishes the meaning of the text. There are scholars who kind of work in one field more than the other, and I don't mean to overgeneralize or say that scholars only work in one area, but if you think of people like John Garth or Dimitra Fimi, they tend to focus more on biographical information, cultural information surrounding the production of the work. So those will tend to land more towards kind of authorial meaning, that kind of thing. If you think about Corey Olson, who does like such close readings of the text, and he's all about like, let's take one paragraph and talk about it for 2 hours, which is fascinating. Um, but that's very much the text is where the meaning comes from. And then I'm the one who's like, let's see what random people think about the book and let's talk about that because that's fun. So that's definitely the reader interpretation. And of course, different approaches blend them as well. So, but I really like to try and discuss that whenever I talk about Tolkien's work because I think a misunderstanding of that triangle is what leads to a lot of online arguments. Because whenever I post anything about, hey, some readers think this about the book, I'm inevitably yelled at for saying that that's the meaning of the book. It's like, no, I never said anything about that being the exclusive authoritative meaning of the book. I'm all about the readers and their opinions, um, because that is definitely where I'm most at home in that triangle of meaning, and that's just where I find the most um, passion, honestly, for digging into interesting bits and pieces. So that, in a way, that kind of almost fascination with the way that readers interpret a text led me from the PhD into the actual Tolkien Experience project and podcast, which both grew out of. I had to kind of go around and promote the PhD to get participants. And so many times I would have people over the age of 18 coming to me and being like, okay, so can I do it? Can I fill out a form? Can I take a survey? Can I? And so I was like, yeah, I probably should actually make a thing for people to do this because I mean, one of the things I'm kind of the a banner bearer for is that everyone's experience has value, and so that's why I created the Tolkien Experience Project, where it was 5 questions and anyone could fill out those 5 questions and it would be posted on my blog. And from that, then did the Tolkien Experience podcast, which was kind of a much more selective approach to me reaching out to um, people who kind of helped coordinate Tolkien communities or scholars that I think have done a lot of work in the Tolkien field, but maybe aren't kind of household names, not I mean, they're well respected within the academic community, but they're not necessarily well known in kind of the larger fan community. Interviewing them with those same 5 questions. And those typically were like, how did you first interact with Tolkien? What brings you back to Tolkien? Why does he have so much meaning for you? Those kinds of questions. And that's kind of the thing that I love to do the most is kind of sit in that space between scholarship and fandom and kind of wade those waters and make it murky to show that in a way, almost all your Tolkien scholars are fans, and those fans who are really interested in it often bridge the gap over into scholarship if they really want to enough. So yeah, kind of a long roundabout way of saying finally getting to the the Tolkien experience stuff, but um, coming about it in a way that I think it's kind of highlights the impact that it had on my project as a whole. Just breaking down some of those kind of artificial barriers between different groups and communities.
Oh man, I mean everything you said, I just like yes, yes, yes. I think that we've had conversations and message each other in different things, and I think we come pretty close to almost hitting everything as far as conceptually and theory wise. And I come in from from a punk background. I talk about it all the time, and it's very much like old school punk music is very much small venues. The bands and the crowd are sort of cohesive, and sort of change in between, and you can't really have one without the other. And I get a lot of similar sort of vibes from the way that you approach the Tolkien Experience project, how you approach your dissertation, and that stuff is just super cool. Reader response is dope. Um, yeah, yeah, I love it. Well, cool, man. Thanks for taking the time to just talk about your project, and then the dissertation. So I guess where can people go online to find more of your stuff? And do you have any other Tolkien projects or otherwise in the queue?
Yeah. Well, I'll start by saying that kind of the biggest upcoming project I have is I'm co-editing the Oxford Handbook of Tolkien with Dimitri Fimi, and we're hoping that that's going to come out next year sometime. But it's going to be covering a lot of different aspects of Tolkien's work, 40 some odd chapters, and it's really meant to be if you're like just a fan, really wanting to get into Tolkien scholarship, and you have some idea about how you want to do that. So, for instance, I'm writing a chapter on reader response theory. So it tells you kind of here's some of the background and key readings that you need to be familiar with, and here's an example of what that looks like. And it's a short chapter, like 6,000 words, and that covers all of that. And we have, a chapter for all different kinds of kind of theoretical approaches, but then we have chapters on kind of biographical information. We have chapters on kind of thematic elements of the work or world building. And then we also have chapters on kind of what we've called legacies, like where have we seen his impact and influence in like gaming, music, television, movies, theater, all those kinds of things. So it's really going to be very broad in scope and really kind of try to catch people at the beginning of that scholarly career and help usher them into a place of comfort with it. But at the same time, also be a helpful tool for those of us more who have been more in the field for longer to kind of reference back to and be like, okay, this isn't the place that I'm most comfortable with, but let me go back and look at this chapter and refamiliarize myself with it in case I want to, write a paper for an upcoming conference that's not necessarily my wheelhouse or something like that. So that's kind of the biggest project that I have coming. The quickest turnaround is going to be Westmoot for this year. That's going to be just this coming month. It's just around the corner, and that's going to be in Minneapolis. And I am presenting there on part of my PhD research. That's going to be looking specifically at the way that Tolkien describes the leaves and the trees in Lothlorien as gold and silver. Some readers take that as metaphorical, and some readers take that as literal. And why does that happen, and what does that mean as a reader? What's the difference between that? That's kind of where that presentation is going to live and investigate. And in terms of finding me online, I have public accounts on both Blue Sky and on Instagram. Both of those are just Luke B. Shelton. You can find me in both places. I don't post a lot on Instagram, but what I do post are like Westmoot coming up. I'll post some pictures from there, things like that. So most of that does tend to be very Tolkien related. That's why it's kind of infrequent because it's not a very personal account. I do post more frequently on Blue Sky.
Oh man, I'm pumped. I would encourage you to follow Luke, check out his stuff. I'll link his dissertation and the Tolkien Experience Project if you're just interested in seeing some of those. I don't know, is that still open? Can people still do that?
They can.
Yeah.
It's not as frequent as it was. It used to release every Tuesday, but now it's whenever I get an entry, I'll turn it around and I'll talk with the person and get it edited and get it up as soon as I can. Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah. And Westmoot, it's a Tolkien Society event in the United States. I'll link that too as a member of the Tolkien Society. Also would encourage you to join as well so you can get some cool discounts, from some first news, and then, meet cool people like Luke. So, thanks again, Luke, for doing this.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a great time talking with you.
Same, dude. Same.